Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. Book 5 of Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov contains one of the most famous passages from the work. It's chapter 5, entitled The Grand Inquisitor, in which the Grand Inquisitor, you could say questions, really he more talks to the recently appeared, quite possibly, Jesus Christ on earth. And Ivan brings this up as a response to Alyosha, who is in his turn responding to Ivan, setting out essentially an argument about the problem of evil. And Alyosha says that you asked just now if there's in the whole world a being who could and would have the right to forgive. There is such a being, and he can forgive everything, forgive all and for all, because he himself gave his innocent blood for all and for everything. You've forgotten about him, but it's on him that the structure is being built, and it's to him they will cry out, "Just art thou, Lord, for thy ways have been revealed." And Ivan says, I was just waiting for you to bring this guy up. He says, I haven't forgotten about him. On the contrary, I was wondering why you hadn't brought him up for so long, because in discussions, your people, meaning religious people, usually trot him out first thing. And then he says, Alyosha, I composed a poem once about a year ago, and I'll tell it to you. And he's, what he means by a poem here is some sort of literary creation that Ivan came up with and essentially has memorized. Although in the way that he's going to present it, he has some side comments and little extra conversations here and there. So Ivan is presenting this poem as a response, as a way of rebutting this bringing up Christ. And it's kind of a strange thing because it doesn't actually provide us with some sort of knockdown, now I got you sort of argument. Instead, it presents this vignette between the Grand Inquisitor, who represents a certain kind of person, and Christ, or somebody who might be Christ. We think that he is in the poem, although Ivan calls this into question at one point. So in the poem, he says that 1,500 years have passed since the time of Christ appearing and having his disciples, his crucifixion, all the other things that have gone along with that. And in this entire time, people have been waiting for him to come back. And Ivan talks about higher powers coming down to earth. He says back then it was customary in poetic works to bring higher powers down to earth, and he goes through a lot of discussions about that. And there's a little bit of a digression here. But then what we find is that he says 15 centuries have gone by since men ceased to receive pledges from heaven. Believe what the heart tells you, for heaven offers no pledge, only faith in what the heart tells you. And then he says, true, there were also many miracles. There were saints who performed miraculous healings to some righteous people. The Queen of Heaven came down, but the devil never rests, and there had already arisen in mankind some doubt as to the authenticity of these miracles. So, miracles are one of those sorts of things that by their very nature are going to be, rather unusual. They violate the laws of nature, however we want to think about it. And some people are going to believe in them and some people aren't. He says then that a heresy arose And the heretics began denying miracles. And then those who believed became all the more ardent in their belief. And what are they doing? The people are crying out to God, asking God to return to them, begging for mercy, wanting to have that presence that is, recorded in the Gospels and all these other texts that people are talking about this. So he says, after so many centuries, they began pleading with faith and fire, God, our Lord, reveal thyself to us. And so Christ comes again. Ivan says he desired to appear to people, if only for a moment, to his tormented, suffering people, rank with sin, but loving him like children. So Christ comes out of mercy, and in the story, he comes in the time of the Inquisition in Spain. He comes down, he says, to the scorched squares of a southern town where just the day before, in a splendid auto de fe, which is fire burning up heretics or other people in the presence of the king, the Cardinal Grand Inquisitor had burned almost 100 heretics at once ad majorem gloriam Dei, which is to the greater glory of God. So Christ appears quietly, inconspicuously, but strange to say, everyone recognized him. And then Ivan has a little aside here. This could be one of the best passages of the poem. I mean, why it is exactly they recognize him. People are drawn to him by an invincible force. They flock to him, surround him, follow them. The sun of love shines in his heart. Rays of light, enlightenment, and power stream from his eyes and pouring over the people, shake their hearts with responding love. He stretches forth his hands to them, blesses them, and from the touch of him, even if only in his garments, comes a healing power. And he gives you some examples of this, an old man who's blind. And then finally, there's a daughter, a young woman who's died, and her mother says, if it's really you, Jesus, raise my child. And then, we have a sort of repetition of one of the narratives from the New Testament. Christ comes and looks with compassion, says, Talitha kumi, and the damsel arose. The girl rises up in her coffin, sits up, and smiling, looks around in wide-eyed astonishment. There's a commotion among the people, cries, weeping, and at this very moment, the Grand Inquisitor arrives. Now, the Grand Inquisitor, you would think, since he's a Christian, and he's been burning all the heretics who denied miracles, you'd think that this guy would be like, whoa, this is amazing. Jesus is returned. I've been hoping for this my entire life. That's not what actually happens. Instead, it's almost the reverse. He tells his guards, arrest that guy. And the crowd parts. They arrest him. They take him to a prison cell. And later on that night, the Grand Inquisitor goes down there to question him. Now, he's not actually going to question him in any real way. I suppose you could say he's posing questions to him, but he's not getting any answers because the person who's just been doing these miracles doesn't say anything to him, except at the very end where he gives him a kiss. So what's the rest of this poem? It's the Grand Inquisitor making some arguments, giving some explanations, issuing some challenges to this Christ who has appeared before his people. And it's interesting because, again, another little digression in the story where Alyosha breaks in and says, is this boundless fantasy or some mistake on the old man's part, some impossible qui pro quo? Now, we're used to hearing quid pro quo, which means one thing for another. Qui pro quo means taking one person for another. So like maybe it was a vagrant who happened to have drawn a crowd and the old man, his eyes don't work that well. And he's like, well, that guy's pretending to be Christ or maybe is Christ. We're going to take him in. And Ivan says, it doesn't really matter that much as far as the story goes. It says, assume it's the latter if you like. If you want it to be qui pro quo, let it be. Of course, the man is 90 years old, might have lost his mind over his idea. He might have been struck by the prisoner's appearance. Could be simple delirium. Could be all these sorts of things. The only thing is that the old man needs to speak out. That finally, after all his 90 years, he speaks out and says aloud all that he has been silent about for 90 years. So this is the old man making his own position clear, making the reasons why he has been doing the things that he's doing and why other people like him are as well. He's essentially giving a speech to Christ, to God incarnate, about why his services are no longer needed and why him coming to his people is actually making some trouble. So he says, this is going back a little bit, "Is it you?" Receiving no answer, he quickly adds, "Don't answer, be silent. After all, what could you say? I know too well what you would say. You have no right to add anything to what you've already said once." Meaning, you did your thing back in biblical times, and you don't get to add anything new here. We've got it from this point. We, meaning the church, the religious authorities, the intelligentsia, whoever it's supposed to be. He says, "You've come to interfere with us, and you know it yourself. You know what's going to happen tomorrow? We're going to burn you. We're going to kill you." And that entire crowd is going to be cool with that. They're going to watch it, and they're going to do nothing to stop it from happening, and they'll actually be okay with it. So he goes on, and he says, the old man points out to him he has no right to add anything to what has already been said once. That, if you like, is the most basic feature of Roman Catholicism, in my opinion at least. Everything has been handed over by you to the Pope. Therefore, everything now belongs to the Pope, and you may as well not come at all now, or at least don't interfere with us for the time being. And so, this may be a little bit of a misrepresentation, from the Orthodox perspective of the Catholics, but there is something to this. The idea is that, listen, we don't need you, the founder, anymore, even if you happen to be God. We are taking care of things. Don't rock the boat. Don't interfere. So that's an interesting thing to say to what's supposed to be the not just originator, but object of worship of your group. Another key point that he's going to be making, that we'll explore in more depth, is that the church and the Grand Inquisitor and his types have succeeded in getting people to freely give up their freedom. Christ came to bring freedom and gave it to people through his sacrifice. And what do they do with that freedom? Freedom is a hard thing to live with. It's a hard thing to manage. This is a central existentialist theme that many people can't handle freedom. They choose to give it up to somebody, to something else. In this case, it's to the church. Another key thing that he brings up, and this occupies a large part of the poem, is the three temptations. And, if you want to find these temptations, they're in the Gospels. Christ, early on in his ministry, or you might even say before his ministry, goes out into the desert to fast for 40 days and nights. And the devil comes to him and issues these three temptations. The first one is, you're pretty hungry, aren't you, guy? Why don't you turn those stones into bread? You could do it in just saying a word, and then you could, not be hungry. And in this case, the temptation is not going to be for Christ himself. It's instead going to be for the people. Are they going to prioritize bread over other things? And there's several other temptations as well. But he goes on and he says that, here's the passage. The dread and intelligent spirit, the spirit of self-destruction and non-being, the great spirit spoke with you in the wilderness and has been passed on to us in books that he supposedly tempted you. Did he really? Was it possible to say anything more than what he proclaimed to you in his three questions? And at the same time, if ever a real thundering miracle was performed on earth, it was on that day. The miracle lay precisely in the appearance of these three questions. If it was possible to imagine, just as a trial and example, that these three questions of the dread spirit had been lost from the books without a trace, and it was necessary they be restored, thought up, and invented anew, to that end all the wise men on earth, rulers, high priests, scholars, philosophers, poets, were brought together, given this task to think up, to invent three questions such as would not only correspond to the scale of the event, but would express in three words the entire future history of mankind, do you think all the combined wisdom of earth could think up anything faintly resembling these three questions? These three questions set out something essential to the human condition, and not just for individuals, but for humans living together in society. So that's going to be a very important part of what the Grand Inquisitor is explaining. And then finally, another point that the Grand Inquisitor is going to make is that he himself and his brethren are taking on this sacrifice themselves of managing humanity, taking the freedom that humanity has given them, that they've talked humanity into giving away, and giving humanity happiness instead in place of that freedom. They're the people who are managing it, the elite. They are not happy. They are actually pretty busy. They have a lot of problems. And they know the truth. So they act in freedom to take away others' freedom to make those others happy. And Christ coming along would upset the proverbial apple cart. So the Grand Inquisitor has to get rid of him. And that's what the conversation, if you want to call it, it's rather a one-sided conversation, a monologue, although it does have some interrogatory points, between the Grand Inquisitor and Christ is really all about. And now, come back out of this. This is a poem that has characters in it that Ivan himself has come up with and is positioning them this way, and then providing to his brother Alyosha. Dostoevsky is providing this to us, the readers.